good evening, and welcome. Wherever you are in the world, perhaps listening from your bed, or resting after a long day, take a slow, deep breath. Tonight, we travel back to a world of stone towers, quiet tapestries, and soft candlelight. A time both distant and strangely familiar. The Middle Ages, the world of medieval princesses, and the still, waiting lives they led. Before we begin, I invite you to think about where you are listening from. Are you somewhere modern, surrounded by soft light and gentle hums of the present? Or are you somewhere quiet, where the air is cool and time feels slower? Wherever you are safe here. Let your mind rest as we descend, calmly, into the past. When we think of princesses, it's easy to imagine a life of luxury, crowns, silks, jewels, and grand banquets. But for most of history, being born royal or noble was not a fairy tale. It was a burden of duty, isolation, and expectation. A young woman of noble birth in the medieval world had little control over her own life, even less than the peasants who served her family. She was born not as an individual, but as a symbol. Her purpose was political, not personal. A princess existed to be married off to secure alliances, end wars, or strengthen her family's claim to power. From the moment of her birth, she was part of a negotiation. In many European courts between the 12th and 15th centuries, noble daughters were raised in their world was made up of teachers, attendants, and chaplains, a kind of polite captivity inside stone walls. The young women were carefully taught religion, languages, embroidery, and music, all skills meant to make them appear graceful and obedient. They were rarely allowed to speak freely in council, to choose their company, or to travel without permission. Even letters, if they were allowed to write them, were often read and approved by servants or family members before being sent. A princess was expected to represent her family's honor, not her own thoughts. And so, her life became a ritual of waiting. Waiting for a betrothal, for a political decision, for permission to marry, or simply for the years to pass inside a castle tower. These towers were not dungeons in the dramatic sense. They were luxurious by comparison to common dwellings. A noble woman's chamber might be adorned with embroidered tapestries, polished chests, carved oak furniture, and soft candlelight. But luxury does not erase loneliness. Imagine long winters inside thick stone walls, where every sound, footsteps, bells, wind, was amplified by echo. The medieval castle was built for defense, not comfort. Cold drafts crept through narrow windows. Fires smoked rather than warmed. The smell of damp stone was constant, and while men rode out to hunt or fight, women often remained enclosed, their lives measured in seasons, prayers, and letters from afar. To be a princess in waiting meant to live in suspension. Every gesture was watched, every word noted, every expression judged for signs of pride or rebellion. A princess could not show anger or sadness publicly. Her life was ceremony, a delicate balance between obedience and grace. Even joy had to be measured. In some royal households, especially in France and England during the later Middle Ages, noble daughters were raised, not by their parents, but by foster families, often distant allies, so that their marriages could later be arranged without emotional resistance. This meant that even in childhood, they belonged not to themselves, but to politics. Yet, despite this, many of these women developed remarkable strength of mind. Isolation often gave them education and introspection that the outer world denied them. Some became patrons of the arts, collecting manuscripts and commissioning translations. Others became correspondents of scholars and theologians, influencing ideas from behind the walls that confined them. For example, Christine de Pizan, a writer in the early 15th century, was not a princess, but she observed and wrote about women of courtly life. She noted that the most powerful women of her age were those who used patience and intellect as their weapons. They could not fight battles, but they could influence kings. They could not travel freely, but their words could. If you were to stand in one of their chambers, let's imagine for a moment, you'd see a narrow window looking out over fields and forests. You might hear the faint toll of church bells far below, and the scratching of a quill as she copied psalms or letters by candlelight. The air would smell faintly of beeswax and smoke. Outside, life moved with the rhythm of horses, bells, and weather. Inside, time felt endless. That is why many royal women of the Middle Ages turned to crafts of patience, embroidery, music, and reading. It wasn't mere pastime, it was survival. Each stitch in a tapestry, each verse of a song, was a quiet rebellion against boredom and powerlessness. It was their way to make beauty inside captivity. And yet, behind every carefully composed portrait or gilded manuscript lies a truth. A royal woman's life was never truly her own. Even queens were often pawns in larger games, traded, exiled, married off again, or imprisoned when politics shifted. For princesses in waiting, those not yet married, the uncertainty was even greater. Their future could change with a single diplomatic letter. To be a princess in the medieval world meant to live surrounded by beauty, but without freedom, to sleep under velvet covers, but with the weight of expectation pressing on your chest, to be seen by everyone and truly known by no one. So, tonight, as you rest, imagine that distant world, not as a fantasy, but as a quiet lesson from history. Behind the policy crowns and painted smiles were human hearts, often patient, sometimes frightened, but always enduring. They lived in silence so that kingdoms might speak. And as you drift toward rest, remember, even in a stone tower, the human spirit, curious, observant, dreaming, always found a way to reach the window. If you're still awake, let your breathing slow again. And if you're just joining, hello, wherever you may be in the world. Tonight, we drift quietly back into the past, to the echoing corridors of medieval castles, to the silent classrooms of noble daughters, the princesses in waiting. When a royal child was born, the celebrations were grand bells, feasts, gifts of gold and silk. But the tone of joy changed subtly, depending on one simple fact: the baby's gender. A son meant strength, continuity, a future king. A daughter meant alliance, negotiation, a gift to be exchanged one day in marriage. From the moment she opened her eyes, a princess's purpose was already written for her. And so, her education began not in freedom, but in formation, shaping her into what her family, her realm, and her faith required. Imagine a chamber high in a stone, keep tapestries on the walls, colored with saints and gardens, a fire burning low. Here, a small group of girls sit at a long wooden table, guided by a governess or a chaplain. They read from illuminated manuscripts, their fingers tracing letters in Latin, French, or sometimes the local tongue. Their lessons were not about curiosity, they were about conduct. They were taught how to move gracefully, how to sit still for hours, how to speak softly but clearly. They learned languages of diplomacy, hymns of devotion, and the etiquette of silence. Every lesson was a rehearsal for a future court, a place where one careless gesture could change the fate of kingdoms. Music filled their days, gentle melodies from the lute, harp, or not played for pleasure, but for demonstration. A noblewoman's refinement was measured by her grace in art. Embroidery and tapestry were essential skills too. They were ways to fill endless hours of waiting, yes, but also to show devotion and patience. In royal courts, fine needlework was a sign of virtue. A princess's hands might never plow a field, but they would labor quietly over silk and thread, turning stillness into beauty. Every stitch told others she was dutiful, obedient, and pure. And then came the moral lessons, often the most important of all. From dawn prayers to evening scripture, noble girls were steeped in the language of humility. They were taught that obedience was strength, that patience was holy, and that pride was a dangerous sin. The world around them was shaped by religion, not just in worship, but in the rhythm of every day. Church bells marked the hours. Confession cleansed the conscience. Even their thoughts were trained to move within walls. A young princess's education, then, was not designed to make her think, but to make her fit. To fit into marriage, to fit into ceremony, to fit into silence. But not all teaching was gentle. Courtly life demanded precision in words, gestures, and appearances. If she misstepped, she could be corrected sharply, even humiliated, before hôtels. A misplaced smile, an unguarded laugh, a wrong glance toward a foreign guest. Any could be noted as a flaw. For a royal woman, one's reputation was like glass. Once cracked, never fully mended. So they learned to watch themselves constantly, even when no one seemed to be watching. They learned how to move within invisible boundaries, how to smile politely without revealing sadness, how to listen more than they spoke. These were not just lessons. They were survival. At times, their education would include glimpses of power, how to host a feast, how to receive guests, how to read royal decrees or manage estates. Some noble daughters, particularly those close to thrones, were trained in statecraft and politics, but always through men, through fathers, brothers, or tutors. Knowledge was permitted, but authority was not. Only a few, through intellect and circumstance, found ways to use what they learned. Isabella of Castile, Catherine of Aragon, Margrethe of Scotland, all were once princesses who turned their early training into strength later in life, but their early years were the same. A life of stillness, of lessons, and of waiting for a future decided by others. One might imagine that in their long hours of study, they sometimes wondered what freedom felt like, to ride out beyond the gates, to walk in a village, to choose their own day's purpose. Yet, most would never know. Their duty was to remain unseen, until chosen like jewels locked in a chest, precious, admired, but rarely touched by real life. In some ways, these women were educated not for life itself, but for presentation, for moments of display. Their intelligence, charm, and grace were expected to shine during a royal meeting or a diplomatic feast, and then retreat again into silence. So their days blurred together. Prayer, embroidery, reading, music, waiting. Always waiting. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint echoes of that life. The rustle of linen gowns, the hum of a psalm, the scratching of a quill, the hush of conversation when a tutor enters the room, the quiet sigh when lessons end, and the door closes again. Centuries have passed, but the idea remains haunting, that brilliance and beauty could be shaped, contained, and traded, not for the woman's sake, but for the ambition of men who never knew her heart. As you rest, think about how history remembers these princesses. So many of their names have faded, their portraits lost, their letters burned or forgotten, yet their lives shaped nations through marriages, births, and treaties signed in their names. They lived lives of restraint so that dynasties could rise. Let your mind drift on that thought. How silence, sometimes, can be the foundation of history, and how behind the grandeur of medieval courts was the quiet endurance of women whose voices were rarely heard, but whose presence changed everything. If you've stayed with me so far, take a slow breath, and imagine the soft flicker of candlelight against stone walls. A quiet hall somewhere in the heart of medieval Europe, where the air smells faintly of parchment and wax. Tonight, we listen not for laughter or song, but for the low, deliberate voices of politics. Because this is where most royal marriages began, not in romance, but in rooms of strategy. In the medieval world, marriage was not primarily a matter of the heart. It was a tool of diplomacy for kings, queens, and noble families. Marriage was the safest way to build alliances, end wars, and claim land. And in that intricate web of alliances, a princess was both gift and guaranteed. She represented peace, trust, and legitimacy, but also a subtle threat. To marry a king's daughter meant to join his bloodline. To refuse, who could mean to question his power. So, behind the smiles and ceremonies, every royal marriage was a kind of treaty. These agreements often began when the children were still very young. A girl of 6, 8, or 10 might already be promised to a boy in another kingdom. A boy she would not meet for many years, if ever. The announcement of such a betrothal was made publicly with celebration and ceremony. But what few people saw was the paperwork behind it, the exchange of letters, seals, and oaths between courts. The church approved the unions, scribes recorded them, and couriers carried the news across borders. To the world, it was an act of diplomacy. To the child herself, it was simply her fate. Sometimes, these alliances were broken before they began. A shift in politics. A new war, a new ruler, could dissolve a betrothal overnight. For the young princess, it meant another round of waiting, another engagement, another future. Each promise, each broken oath, reshaped her life, and yet she had no voice in any of it. To her family, she was not a person being chosen. She was the bridge between two houses, and that bridge could be rebuilt, replaced, or abandoned depending on the season's politics. For the most powerful kingdoms, England, France, Castile, Burgundy, the Holy Roman Empire, the web of royal marriages was vast and intricate. Princesses were often sent far from home, across languages and customs, sometimes never to return to their homeland again. A French princess might marry into the English crown, a Scottish one into Scandinavia, a Castilian daughter into Austria. Each marriage was a political chess move, and yet each was a human life uprooted and planted in foreign soil. Imagine what it meant at 14 or 15 years old. To leave behind everything familiar, your mother, your childhood tutors, your language, and ride for weeks toward a kingdom you had only heard about in letters. The journey itself could be perilous. Through mountains, across rivers escorted by guards and priests. When the young bride arrived, she was greeted by music and ceremony. But beneath the surface, she was a stranger. Everyone watched her closely. How she spoke, what say what, whether she seemed pleased or proud. Every smile, every nod, could be interpreted as a signal of alliance or arrogance. The church played a central role in all of this. A marriage between two royal houses required papal approval, especially if the families were related, and most European nobility were, by blood or marriage. Papal dispensations were common, and with them came delicate negotiations involving gifts, influence, and political promises. The ceremony itself was sacred, but the intention behind it was rarely spiritual. Marriages were often finalized before witnesses with a formal contract of dowry and dower. Gold, lands, castles, and towns were written into the agreement. A woman's body, her future children, an heir title, all part of the bargain. For a medieval princess, there was rarely space for hope or refusal. She might not even meet her betrothed until the day of the wedding. And yet, history shows that some learned to navigate this system with quiet skill. They used correspondence, influence, and intelligence to shape their positions once married. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, turned diplomacy into a lifelong art, traveling, advising, even ruling as regent while kings went to war. But such power was the exception, not the rule. For most, the political marriage meant exchanging one kind of confinement for another. Even before marriage, a princess's body was guarded as a symbol of purity and legitimacy. Her virginity was not just a private matter, it was a state concern. Her reputation could affect treaties, inheritance, even wars. And so, her interactions were carefully controlled. She was watched, chaperoned, and spoken for by others. Her body belonged to the dynasty long before it belonged to her husband. To modern ears, it sounds distant, like something out of legend, but it was the lived reality of centuries of women whose names were used to sign alliances. Their portraits were exchanged before they were, their fates decided by maps and ink, their emotions written over by politics. And yet, inside that quiet obedience, there must have been moments of reflection, moments where a young princess, alone in her tower, looked out over the cold horizon and wondered what her future husband was like. Whether he was kind, whether he would see her as a person, or a surprise, whether she would ever return home. So when we speak of medieval diplomacy, we must also remember the unseen faces behind it. The daughters who crossed mountains so that kingdoms could sign treaties. The women whose lives were spent not in choosing, but in being chosen. Their stories remind us that history is not only made by battles or kings, but also by quiet sacrifices, woven into the tapestry of power. The kind of sacrifices that never made it into the chronicles, but changed the course of Europe all the same. Now, as the candles in our imagination burn low, let that thought settle softly in your mind, that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in power, but in endurance. Not in the noise of conquest, but in the silence of waiting. If you followed from the beginning, take another slow breath in and out. Let the day settle behind you, and let the quiet voice of history guide you again. We've followed the princess through her lessons, her waiting, and her betrothal. Now, she has crossed the border. She has become what she was raised to be, a queen, a wife, a symbol of alliance. But her journey is not an ending. It is the beginning of another kind of solitude. When a medieval princess arrived in her husband's kingdom, the transition was both magnificent and terrifying. She entered the realm as both a guest and a stranger. Her marriage united nations, but her presence could also stir jealousy, fear, and gossip. For the new queen, every mobemen, every smile, every word, became part of a new kind of diplomacy. In public, she was the embodiment of grace. In private, she was often isolated, surrounded by courtiers who spoke another language, served by attendants she didn't yet trust, and watched by a husband she barely knew. Royal weddings themselves were grand affairs. The processions stretched for miles, banners, trumpets, gifts, nobles dressed in velvet and fur. The church ceremony was rich with symbolism, rings of gold, vows in Latin, and the blessing of a priest. But beneath the pageantry was a quiet reality. The young bride had been moved from one life into another, her future now bound entirely to the ambitions of her new family. After the ceremony came the entry into the city, a tradition known in many courts as the royal welcome. Citizens lined the streets, watching her every gesture. If she smiled too much, she could be called frivolous. If she looked too solemn, she could be called cold. Her very presence became a reflection of the new alliance. Inside the royal palace, her world was both vast and confined. Rooms upon rooms, halls of polished stone, chambers filled with tapestries, gardens where the wind carried the sound of fountains. Yet, within all that grandeur, her role was sharply limited. A queen consort was expected to bear heirs, to support her husband, to embody virtue and piety. She was the moral mirror of the court, an example for the women, and a symbol of stability for the realm. But she was not expected to rule. Even her influence was meant to be quiet, indirect, almost invisible. A whisper to the king, a gentle word in council, a favor granted to a petitioner. Power, for her, existed in shadows. To adjust to her new home, she often relied on a small circle of attendants, women from her homeland, perhaps a chaplain or a trusted governess. But even they could be taken away, dismissed if they were seen as too foreign, too loyal to her native crown. And so, once again, the queen learned to build her world inside herself, a world of memory and restraint. Many queens turned to art and devotion. They commissioned chapels, collected books, or supported money. These acts were seen as charitable, but they were also ways to leave a mark, a quiet statement that said, "I was here. I mattered." The challenge of being a foreign queen was loneliness shaped by formality. She could never fully belong to her husband's people, yet she was expected to love them. She could not show weakness, yet she lived constantly in the eyes of others. Even friendship was political. Every companion could become a liability. Every smile could be used in court gossip. And then there was motherhood, both a duty and a danger. Her worth in the eyes of the court often depended on whether she produced a male heir. If Safai led, she might be blamed for it. If she succeeded, her children could be used against her as tools of power, or as hostages to loyalty. History remembers a few who navigated this life with brilliance. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who traveled with crusaders and ruled in her own right. Catherine of Aragon, who brought dignity and scholarship to the English court. And of Bohemia, whose grace softened tensions between England and Central Europe. But for every famous queen, there were dozens whose names have been lost. Women who smiled in portraits, wrote no letters that survived, and whose stories ended with the words, "And she bore him children." For a young queen, adaptation was survival. She learned new customs, new languages, new rituals of respect. At meals, she sat beside her husband but spoke only when spoken to. At court ceremonies, she was both an ornament and an observer. Even her clothing was symbolic. The fabrics and colors she wore often signified allegiance to her husband's house, not to her own. In the evenings, when the formalities ended, she might retreat to her private chambers, rooms quieter, gentler, where the air smelled of herbs and burning candles. There, she could finally breathe. Perhaps she prayed, or read, or simply sat by the fire, listening to the wind outside the high, narrow windows. Even in those quiet hours, she was never fully alone. Maids and guards kept watch. Servants moved quietly through corridors. But in her thoughts, she might wander home to the voices, the language, the music she left behind. To be a foreign queen was to live between worlds, between nations, between loyalties, between silence and ceremony. Her strength was not in rebellion, but in endurance. She became a bridge once more, this time not between her father's realm and her husband's, but between her own heart and the world that demanded she serveth. And so, when we look at portraits of medieval queens, their faces calm, their hands folded, their eyes lowered, we might remember that those gestures were not just manners, they were defenses, masks worn with grace, because in a world built by men, to remain composed was sometimes the only power left to her. Let that image rest in your mind now. The queen in her quiet chamber, the firelight reflecting on gold thread and silk, the silence between two kingdoms settling softly in her chest. She has become the symbol everyone needed her to be, and yet, within her stillness, there is thought and wisdom and quiet defiance. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders relax. You followed our journey from the young princess's education, her betrothal, her marriage, and her arrival in Fortnite. Tonight, we open a new door to the part of her life that history rarely explains fully, how she influenced the world, even when it seemed she had no power at all. In the medieval court, visible authority belonged almost entirely to men, kings, bishops, generals, advisors, yet behind their decisions, quiet hands, letters written in delicate script, and the calm, deliberate voices of women who understood how to guide without being seen. This was the silent politics of queenship, a system of grace, persuasion, and intelligence, carried out not in war councils, but in conversation, correspondence, and ritual. The queen might not sit in parliament or sign decrees, but she could influence who stood beside the king. Her approval or disapproval could shape careers. Her recommendations could bring fortunes, or ruin. And often, she acted not for herself, but to protect her children, inheritance, or to preserve peace between families. The art of intercession, speaking on someone's behalf, was one of the few political tools available to women. Petitioners would approach the queen, asking her to plead with the king for mercy or favor. Her ability to grant or withhold her support made her a quiet gatekeeper of royal generosity. Through letters, many queens reached far beyond their immediate courts. Their handwriting traveled across mountains and seas, carrying messages to other monarchs, popes, abbots, and nobles. These letters were often written in soft tones, words of prayer, goodwill, or condolences, but hidden within them were requests, suggestions, or warnings. A single sentence in a queen's letter could influence a war, secure a treaty, or reconcile to rival lords. And because she was expected to be gentle, her persuasion was often underestimated, which made it all the more effective. Art was another form of power. Many queens became patrons of artists, scribes, and musicians. They commissioned illuminated manuscripts, religious paintings, and cathedrals, not merely for beauty, but as acts of political symbolism. By building churches or funding efforts, they strengthened their reputations as pious, noble, and charitable. A queen who was seen as God-fearing could influence the moral tone of the entire kingdom. Her piety became a form of authority, soft but enduring. Religion offered both comfort and opportunity. In a deeply Christian age, devotion was expected of women. Within that expectation lay a subtle freedom. Queens founded convents, appointed abbots, and sometimes corresponded directly with the Pope. Their patronage created networks of loyalty that stretched across Europe. A queen's chapel, often located near her private rooms, became her sanctuary and her court in miniature. There, she could host priests, scholars, and pilgrims. Each conversation carefully watched, but gently directed. Faith, for her, was not just belief, it was diplomacy wrapped in prayer. Some queens found ways to express influence through culture. In France, noblewomen like Eleanor of Aquitaine helped shape the language of chivalry and courtly love ideas that softened the image of warfare and introduced new ideals of honor and restraint through stories, poetry, and patronage. They transformed how men imagined nobility itself. In England, Margaret of Anjou used art and pageantry to reinforce her husband's legitimacy. In Castile, Isabella I later used religious reform and education as instruments of power. And throughout Europe, countless unnamed women used beauty and virtue not as decoration, but as strategy. Yet, even the most powerful of queens walked a narrow path. If she appeared too assertive, she could be called ambitious. If she remained too silent, she could be accused of weakness. Every act of kindness could be read as a scheme. Every expression of intelligence could be seen as manipulation. And so, these women learned to move carefully through the web of politics, not breaking the rules, but bending them gently, until they could shape the world to their will without leaving fingerprints. Beyond courts and letters, their greatest influence often came through their children. Queens were the teachers of future rulers. They shaped kings and queens, not through lectures, but through the tone of their households, the examples they set, and the lessons they whispered in private. Behind every wise or foolish king stood the memory of a mother's quiet instruction, a hand that once guided his, a voice that once taught him patience or pride. And through those children, the queen's legacy outlived her reign. When we speak of medieval history, we often name the kings, the conquerors, the saints. But if we look closer, we see the fingerprints of women everywhere, in the manuscripts they funded, the alliances they stitched together, and the generations they raised. Their influence was rarely loud. It did not echo in battlefields or chronicles, but it hummed quietly beneath the surface of power, the steady pulse of wisdom in a world of noise. So, tonight, as you rest, think of those hidden architects of history, the queens who ruled without thrones, the princesses who turned silence into strength. Their tools were grace, patience, and intelligence. Their victories were seldom sung, but they changed the shape of the world all the same. Let that thought drift with you as you breathe, and imagine the flicker of a candle in a queen's writing chamber, the soft scratching of her quill, the ink drying on parchment as she finishes a letter that would cross seas and quietly change the fate of kingdoms. In the medieval world, image was not decoration. It was power, visible, deliberate, and essential. Every color, every fabric, every movement had meaning. In an age when few could read, and fewer still could speak directly to the movement, appearance became a language understood by all. For a princess or queen, that language was her own. It could conceal fear, display authority, and command loyalty, without a single word spoken. When a royal woman appeared in public, the people saw not the person, but the symbol. She represented the dignity of the crown, the virtue of her family, and the stability of the realm. Her clothing had to carry all of that meaning, to assure, impress, and sometimes intimidate. Sumptuous fabrics, velvets from Italy, silks from Byzantium, furs from Russia, and pearls from distant seas were more than luxury. They were messages. They declared the kingdom's wealth, the success of its trade routes, and the queen's connection to the wider world. To wear gold-threaded silk was to remind the court that her husband's realm was prosperous. To wear deep blue or crimson was to echo divine majesty, colors associated with the Virgin Mary and the kingship itself. But beneath the beauty's burden, every appearance was an act of control. Her smile measured, her gestures rehearsed, her emotions hidden behind layers of silk and embroidery. In portraits, queens rarely looked directly at the viewer. Instead, they gazed slightly down, their hands folded or resting on an object, a book, a flower, a rosary, each detail chosen with care. Even in painted stillness, they spoke the language of restraint. Ceremony magnified this language. Coronations, processions, and feast days were grand theaters of pomp. Trumpets, banners, and incense filled the air, and at the center of it all stood the queen, poised, radiant, and utterly composed. Her very presence could turn politics into poetry when she knelt before the altar. It symbolized humility and devotion, yet everyone watching understood it also displayed royal piety. A divine legitimacy no general or noble could challenge. Every bow of her head, every slow step must move. It became part of a centuries-old choreography that said, wordlessly, this is authority papacy. Even in private audiences, her appearance mattered. Ambassadors reported not only what she said, but how she said it, the cut of her sleeves, the color of her jewels, the expression in her eyes. She listened. One ambassador described meeting a French queen, wearing a crown, but whose dignity made the crown unnecessary. Another wrote that a queen's gown shimmered like sunlight on water, and that her calm silence unsettled even the most confident men. Such reports traveled far, shaping how other courts perceived her power. A single gown could become a statement of policy. A single gesture could change a negotiation. The act of being seen was for royal women, both an honor and a triumph. They lived their lives as public art, painted, embroidered, displayed, and judged. To dress simply was to risk being thought weak. To dress richly was to invite envy. Every color had meaning. Every absence, too, even illness or mourning, became performance, marked by black veils and quiet processions. Behind the scenes, tailors and seamstresses worked tirelessly to maintain this visual vocabulary, replacing frayed hems, stitching pearls, polishing belts, each outfit prepared for an audience that never rested. But clothing also offered comfort, a rare form of controlling lives, governed by others. Through her wardrobe, a queen could decide how she wished to be seen. She could soften her image with pale colors and modest jewels, or assert strength through vivid tones, rich embroidery. Her fabrics became weapons, her wardrobe, her vocabulary. Some queens used this mastery brilliantly. Eleanor of Provence, for example, brought refined French fashion straight, introducing fitted gowns, jeweled girdles, and subtly emphasized elements of light. Isabella of Castile later used stark simplicity, plain black dresses, modest veils, to project spiritual authority during a time of religious reform. Fashion, for them, was not mere taste. It was diplomacy. And what of the princess in the lonely tower? The one waiting, the one learning how to move in the world's gaze. She, too, was taught these lessons early. In her embroidery lessons, she learned the meaning of colors. In her practiced curtsies, she rehearsed grace. Every thread she stitched prepared her for light and visibility. Even solitude became part of the training. A quiet rehearsal for the composure she would need when the whole court watched her take her first public step as a bride, a consort, or a queen. So, as you drift tonight, picture the rustle of silk and candlelight, the gleam of gold threads catching the evening glow. See the queen standing tall, not as a woman trapped in finery, but as someone who has learned to turn beauty into language, and language into strength. She moves slowly, with purpose. She smiles, faintly, serenely. The hall falls silent, and in that silence, she waits. listener, wherever you are in the gentle dark of your room, or under the soft hum of a distant night, take a breath, deep and calm. Let the world outside fall away for a while. You and I are stepping back in time again, to the echoing halls of stone castles, where light flickered on tapestries, and footsteps faded into silence. Inside those walls, amid all the ceremony and grandeur, there was a kind of quiet that few could understand, the kind that presses softly at first, and then settles on the heart like snow. This was the loneliness of queens. To live in a royal household was to be surrounded by people, servants, courtiers, attendants, ladies, and every hour of the day was observed. Someone was always near to dress you, to accompany you, to serve you food or prayers, and yet you were rarely with anyone, not in the way we needed, not freely, not honestly. Every conversation was measured. Every word could travel farther than it was meant to. Privacy, that small human comfort, was almost impossible. Even in her most personal chambers, the queen was never fully alone. The very walls seemed to listen. The great irony of medieval power was that the higher one rose, the less freedom one had. A peasant girl could walk into a forest and sing. A merchant's wife was her neighbor, but a princess, a queen. Her movements were dictated by duty, security, and expectation. If she wished to ride, it was as part of the procession. If she wished to pray, it was under the eyes of the court. Even her letters were read by others before being sealed. She belonged not to herself, but to the kingdom, to its hopes, its image, its politics. And yet, even in those gilded cages, queens found ways to build small sanctuaries of peace. Some turned to reading a luxury and time. Monks or tutors brought them devotional texts, tales of saints, and heroes written on parchment. The act of reading, or simply being read to, offered a private escape, a doorway to other worlds, other lives. Others found solace in embroidery, stitching flowers, birds, and sacred symbols into cloth. It was patient work, repetitive and soothing, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat, a quiet rebellion against the restless politics outside. Every thread they pulled was a small claim of control in a world where they had little of it. Religious devotion also became a refuge. Queens and princesses often had private chapels within their chambers. These were dimly lit rooms filled with the scent of wax and rose, where they could kneel alone and whisper their prayers. In prayer, they found both comfort and power. To the world, they were petitioners before God, but privately, those moments allowed them something greater, a space where no husband, no counsel, no nation could intrude. In the silence of the chapel, they were not consuls, mothers, or symbols. They were simply souls in search of peace. Loneliness also shaped the way they understood love. Royal marriages were rarely affectionate. They were treaties made for alliances, not companionship. Some couples grew close for time. Mani, Vidmo. Letters from queens often speak of longing, duty, and patience more than passion or joy. And when kings traveled for war or politics, their wives were left to wait months, sometimes years, with only letters and rumors for company. Some queens turned that waiting into purpose. They governed in their husband's absence, signing charters, managing estates, leading armies if they had to. Responsibility filled the emptiness, and in that, they discovered a quiet kind of strength. Still, the sense of isolation lingered, even surrounded by servants and courtiers. Many queens described feeling alone among many. The faces around them were not companions, but mirrors reflecting what was expected of them. A laugh too loud could seem undignified. A frown too long could start a word. So they smiled and moved gracefully, and let the world believe that crowns were light. But the truth was simpler, softer, and sadder. Crowns were heavy, not only on the head, but on the heart. There were nights when a queen might stand by a window, looking out over a sleeping city. She would see the glow of torches in the streets, the slow turning of the stars, and she might wonder how different her life would have been had she been born into another name, another fate. Yet even those thoughts were private things. Tomorrow would bring ceremony, meetings, appearances, the endless rhythm of royal life. And so, she would close the shutters, extinguish the candles, and whisper a small prayer into the silence. It's easy, centuries later, to see these women as distant, painted faces in museums, names in dusty chronicles. But behind those portraits lived real human hearts, tender and weary, who laughed quietly with their maids, who longed for letters from people, who found joy in the scent of spring gardens, or a song carried through stone halls. Their loneliness was not only sought, it was the space where their humanity survived beneath the weight of crowds. So as you lie here tonight, imagine that quiet, the hush of a castle at midnight, the slow crackle of a dying hearth. Somewhere, long ago, a queen stood in her tower and looked at the same moon you see now. She was lonely, yes, but also strong, thoughtful, enduring. And in that stillness, she, too, was listening. For peace, for meaning, for the sound of her own heart, beating softly beneath the silence of power. In the heart of every great castle, there was usually one small, quiet room, often near a window, where sunlight could reach the desk. There, a princess learned her lessons, while the sounds of guards, servants, and courtiers filled the lower halls. Up in that still chamber, the world slowed down. A tutor's voice, gentle but firm, guided her through the art of reading, writing, and thought. This was not just education, it was formation, the shaping of a royal mind. In medieval Europe, knowledge was both privilege and power. Few men could read fluently, and fewer women still. But for the daughters of nobility, education was essential, not for their personal ambition, but for the role they were destined to play. They were to be symbols of refinement, embodiments of grace, faith, and wisdom. They were expected to quote scripture, compose letters, and understand music and manners. Their intelligence was meant to be soft, a quiet intelligence that soothed, not threatened. Yet even within those boundaries, something remarkable happened. Some women began to see that learning itself was freedom. They studied Latin, the language of the church, and diplomacy. They learned the Psalms by heart, and through them absorbed poetry, rhythm, and reflection. They read chronicles of saints and queens, women who had suffered, ruled, or prayed their way into legend. And with each story, a new awareness stirred. Knowledge did not only belong to monks or scholars, it could live in silence, too, in the heart of a woman with a pen. For some, this awakening became their life's quiet rebellion. They began to write letters, reflections, prayers, in careful script. They recorded their thoughts on parchment, never knowing if their words would survive the centuries. A few did. We still read the writings of Christine de Pizan, a woman who, centuries ago, dared to argue that women were capable of wisdom equal to men's. We read the prayers of Marjorie Kemp, who spoke openly about her visions and doubts, and we find traces of countless others, nuns, noblewomen, queens, whose letters revealed tender humanity beneath royal formality. In these writings, we glimpse the real texture of their minds. One queen worries for her child's safety, another reflects on the nature of love and faith, another writes to a friend far away, describing the scent of roses in her courtyard, or the sound of bells echoing through a foggy morning. They were thoughtful observers of their own worlds, witnesses to the age that surrounded them. Through ink and parchment, they found companionship, not in conversation, but in expression. Writing was their quiet voice, their invisible act of resistance against the silence of duty. Music, too, shaped their minds. Queens were taught to sing softly, to play the lute or harp. The melodies were delicate prayers, turned to sound, late at night in the hush after vespers. A princess might rest her fingers on the strings and let the notes fill her chamber, each one a fleeting moment of freedom. In those tones, she could feel her thoughts move, gentle, calm, alive. Music taught her patience, discipline, emotion, all qualities she would need as a ruler's wife and a mother. Some learned philosophy, in careful fragments ideas filtered through religion and tradition. They heard of Aristotle, Augustine, thinkers who spoke of virtue, fate, and divine order. And though few could study deeply, the seed of reflection was planted early. They learned that wisdom was not always loud. Sometimes it lived in listening, in waiting, in understanding the patterns of life that others overlooked. Education also taught them how to write letters, a skill that became one of their greatest strengths. A queen's letter could soothe conflicts, mend alliances, or plead for mercy. Each phrase had to be perfectly balanced, graceful yet firm, humble yet authoritative. In an era when diplomacy often depended on personality, her pen became her voice, and with that voice, she could reach across borders more effectively than armies sometimes could. The most perceptive of these women understood that. Learning made them more than ornaments of courtly life. It gave them clarity. It helped them see patterns of power in human behavior. It allowed them to think quietly when others spoke rashly. They became, in their own ways, philosophers of patience, masters of timing, perception, and restraint. Not by chance, but by long training in reflection. And so, when the world outside their windows turned chaotic, when wars began, or kings fell ill, or courtiers whispered treachery, they often remained still, their thoughts steady and deliberate. In their silence lived intelligence, in their waiting, wisdom. The tower, once a prison, had become their school. Tonight, as you listen, imagine that tower chamber once more, the sound of parchment turning, a candle's flame trembling against the dusk. Somewhere, a young woman bends over her page, writing words no one may ever read. But she writes anyway, because it steadies her heart, because it gives meaning to the stillness, because it keeps her mind alive. And in that act small, unseen, gentle as a breath, she becomes part of the long, quiet story of women who kept knowledge alive in a world that often denied it to them. In the Middle Ages, the fates of kingdoms were often decided not in battlefields, but in the delicate silence of marriage negotiations. And at the center of those negotiations stood women, daughters, sisters, brides, and queens, whose lives became living treaties. It was a world where a single wedding could end a war, and a letter written with care could save thousands of lives. The art of diplomacy was not carved in stone or shouted in councils. It was woven quietly by women who learned to move the world with grace. When a princess was betrothed, her marriage was rarely about love. It was a transaction between crowns. A king would send envoys across the sea to discuss dowries, territories, and inheritances. Months or years of negotiation followed, with ambassadors traveling between courts, carrying portraits, gifts, and promises. And all the while, the young princess waited her future, decided in distant rooms. Yet when she finally crossed the border to her new kingdom, she did not arrive powerless. She arrived as a symbol of peace. Her very presence embodied a promise that two nations would remain bound through her body, her children, and her loyalty. From the moment she stepped onto foreign soil, her actions were watched with hope and fear. Would she bring harmony? Would she favor her homeland or her husband's court? Would her children inherit both legacies? Or would politics tear them apart? Every smile she gave, every word she spoke in public, was read like a message. Diplomacy was not only done through letters. It lived in her posture, her voice, her restraint. Many queens learned to turn that scrutiny into subtle influence. They became bridges between cultures, translators between rival traditions. They carried their homeland's customs into their new courts, sometimes gently transforming the culture of an entire nation. A French princess marrying into England might bring new styles of dress, new songs, new manners. A Spanish queen might introduce new devotional practices or architecture. These details may seem small, but in an age when identity and pride were everything, such changes carried enormous political meaning. Soft power often began with soft fabrics. Letters were the invisible threads that bound this diplomacy together. A queen might write to her brother's court, urging peace, suggesting a truce, or warning against rash decisions. Her handwriting could travel farther than armies, and her tone, graceful, careful, persuasive, could calm tempers where swords had failed. Some letters survive still, addressed to kings, bishops, and popes, written in elegant Latin or the refined vernacular of their age. They reveal women who were not passive correspondents, but shrewd observers of international politics. They understood timing, pride, and persuasion. They knew that even kings listened differently when the words came from a voice of reason and gentleness. Marriage alliances, too, were rarely one-time events. They created decades of correspondence between royal families. A queen became not only a wife, but a diplomatic bridge, the thread through which nations communicated informally. When tensions rose between kingdoms, envoys often approached the queen first. Her advice could temper anger. Her intercession could save face for both sides. She was, in essence, the quiet negotiator behind the throne, the one who spoke when others could not, because her words carried both intimacy and neutrality. Some women excelled in this delicate art. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived in the 12th century, was a master of negotiation and cultural exchange. As queen of both France and later England, she balanced loyalties between rival kingdoms for decades. Isabella of Castile, centuries later, used diplomacy not only through marriage alliances, but through shared religious and cultural policies that united Spain itself. And Margaret of Austria, in the 16th century, became one of the most skilled diplomats of her era, arranging treaties and marriages across Europe, governing the Netherlands with wisdom and tact. Each of them, in her own way, proved that peace could be built, not through might, but through patience. But diplomacy also brought personal cost. To be a human treaty was to live between worlds. A queen's heart was often divided between the land of her birth and the land she served. If the two came into conflict, she would face impossible choices. To speak for her homeland risked being called a traitor. To remain silent was to betray her roots. And so, many learned to master the art of neutrality. The ability to speak without declaring, to feel without showing, to act without being seen. It was the emotional discipline of survival. Beyond politics, there was another kind of diplomacy. The diplomacy of everyday kindness. A queen's presence could reconcile noble families. Her hospitality could soothe the rival factions. And her intercessions could save condemned prisoners. She could not always change the world, but she could soften its edges. And sometimes, that was enough. As you listen tonight, imagine her, a woman standing by a great wooden table, her hand resting on a map spread across the parchment. Lines mark the borders of kingdoms, but she knows that those borders mean nothing. Without trust, without care, without conversation. She dips her quill and begins to write. Her ink flows steadily, her tone is calm, and somewhere, across mountains and seas, a war quietly begins to fade, because she understood the truth that so few did. Peace begins not in treaties, but in the minds of those brave enough to imagine it. In the medieval world, a queen's most sacred duty was to give birth, not simply to children, but to continuity. Her womb was the vessel through which dynasties survived, and her health or fertility was a matter not just of family, but of politics, faith, and fate. Every royal birth was both intimate and public. When a queen conceived, the news spread through every corner of her realm. Prayers were said in churches, bells were rung, and envoys sent letters to distant allies, announcing that the line of succession was secure. But for the woman herself, the experience was rarely peaceful. Pregnancy meant surveillance, midwives, physicians, and courtiers hovered at her bedside, each whispering different remedies, each interpreting signs. Her meals were recorded, her dreams noted, her body, once hers, now a matter of national concern. To bear a son was triumph. To bear a daughters was duty. To bear none at all could be disaster. A queen who failed to produce heirs risked everything: her standing, her marriage, even her life. History remembers Anne of Cleves, Catherine of Aragon, and many others whose fates turned upon the cradle. Each carried the weight of a kingdom within her body, knowing that joy and ruin shared the same horizon. In private, however, motherhood was more than duty. It was also tenderness. Queens, for all their grandeur, still nursed heartbreak, still sang softly to sleeping infants, still feared illness and loss. They lived in a time when childbirth was perilous, and many did not survive it. Every child, then, was both miracle and memorial. Royal nurseries were worlds unto themselves. Soft tapestries lined the walls to guard against the cold, and tutors, nurses, and ladies-in-waiting watched over the heirs. But the queen's presence lingered like perfume, even when she could not remain with her children, when politics demanded they be raised elsewhere. Her influence shaped every detail of their lives. She chose their tutors, their books, their prayers. She whispered to them of their heritage and their duty. Through bedtime stories and morning lessons, she taught them not only how to reign, but how to endure. And in this, the medieval queen became something more than a mother. She became a designer of character. A gentle queen often raised sons who ruled with mercy. A patient one raised daughters who governed through diplomacy. Her tone, her gestures, her values became the unseen laws of the next generation. Even when kings stood at the center of power, their temperaments, their way of ruling, were often reflections of the women who raised them. In this way, motherhood became a silent form of The most famous queens of history are often remembered not for their crowns, but for the children they raised. Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose vast family shaped the map of Europe, watched her sons become kings and warriors, and her daughters become duchesses and queens across the continent. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, governed as regent, while her son came of age, teaching him not only how to rule, but how to pray, how to balance piety with justice, mercy with power. Catherine de' Medici guided 3 French kings through storm and chaos, her will and intelligence keeping the throne from collapse. Behind every powerful dynasty stood women who wove their influence quietly, deliberately, through generations. But there was another side to this legacy, a quieter sorrow. Many royal mothers were separated from their children early. Boys were sent to be educated by scholars or soldiers. Daughters were prepared for marriage at other courts. And so, a queen's motherhood often existed through letters, pages, folded carefully, sealed with wax, filled with advice, prayers, and longing. Some of those letters survive today. Their ink faded but their emotion intact. the ache of a mother speaking across distance and time. When the years passed, and her children took their thrones, a queen often stepped into another role, that of the matriarch. Older now, no longer required to bear heirs, she became a counselor, the calm voice that guided young rulers through the storms of politics. Some withdrew to convents or estates, content to spend their final years in prayer. Others remained active in court, their experience lending weight to every decision. The medieval world revered such figures, mothers whose wisdom outlived their beauty, whose names became synonymous with stability. And yet, for all her strength, the queen's life remained shadowed by She knew that her children's triumphs might not guarantee peace, that her bloodline could rise or vanish within a generation. Dynasties were fragile things, built on marriages, births, and the tides of fortune. But perhaps that is why she loved her children so fiercely. They were not only her legacy, but her redemption, proof that in a world ruled by men and politics, her body, her mind, her care, had shaped the course of history. So as you rest now, imagine the candle by that oak cradle again. It burns low, its flame soft as a heartbeat. A queen sits nearby, her eyes half closed, her voice murmuring a prayer that has no crown, no throne, only love. And in that stillness, you can almost hear the echo of centuries whispering back. That peace, like life itself, is born from gentleness. Every medieval queen lived within a household, not a family home in the modern sense, but a complex, ordered structure of servants, officers, and attendants. It was a world within walls, half domestic, half political, a place where power moved quietly through everyday acts. A royal household was both vast and intimate. Hundreds of people might serve one queen, from noble ladies who shared her chambers, to cooks, scribes, falconers, laundresses, and stable hands. Each had a place, a duty, and a rank, and together they formed a kind of human tapestry, woven tightly around her life. But at its heart, the queen's household was built on ritual. Every moment from rising in the morning to retiring at night followed a pattern carefully observed by those who served her. Before sunrise, the day began with silence, a gentle knock at the chamber door, perhaps her chamberlain or first lady in waiting. The heavy curtains were drawn aside, letting in the pale light of dawn through narrow windows. Candles were lit, and the scent of beeswax filled the air. The queen's linens, washed and perfumed, wary laid out. Her gown for the day hung beside the hearth too warm. It might take an hour or more to dress her layer upon layer of silk, wool, and embroidery, each fastened by careful hands. Every gesture was graceful, deliberate. Even the act of being dressed was a ceremony, a reflection of order and dignity. While she dined on bread and honey, her attendants read aloud the morning petitions, letters from abbeys, requests from nobles, news from distant estates. Every word mattered. Even in her private rooms, the queen was never truly alone. She was always performing the role of sovereignty, even when the king was not present. Her household, though loyal, was also a mirror of the realm. Ambitious families placed daughters in her service to gain proximity to influence. Through gossip, gifts, and small favors, policy was shaped as much by conversation as by decree. In that way, her household became a political court of its own, a quiet, subtler counterpart to the king's. But alongside politics lived daily life. There were moments of softness, embroidery circles, music, prayer. Ladies in waiting practiced their instruments, pages polished silverware, and messengers came and went with folded scrolls. The queen's apartments were often warmer and brighter than the rest of the castle. Tapestries softened the stone walls, and rushes scented with herbs covered the floors. Some rooms were hung with painted cloths showing gardens and stars, a gentle illusion of color in a world of gray stone. The rhythm of her day was slow, ordered, and predictable, and perhaps, for that reason, deeply calming. Her stability was part of her duty. In times of unrest, her calm presence could hold the court together. Around her, every servant's position was defined with precision. The mistress of the robes oversaw her wardrobe and jewels, keeping inventory of every gown and coronet. The chamberlain managed her personal finances and daily routines. The confessor, often a learned cleric, heard her prayers and advised her on matters of conscience. The maids of honor, young women of noble birth, attended her at meals and ceremonies, their own behavior carefully modeled after hers. Each knew their place, their timing, their tone. To move too quickly, to speak too loudly, was to break the fragile harmony that kept the royal household serene. And yet, for all its order, the queen's household was not without warmth. In the evenings, music floated through the corridors, harps, flutes, and voices blending softly. Servants laughed in the kitchens. Children, sometimes the queen's own, sometimes words of the crown, played by the hearth. For a moment, the walls of formality soft. Even the queen, weary from the day's duties, might smile and join in quiet conversation, her crown set aside, her tone more human. It was in these rare, gentle hours that her attendants saw the woman behind the majesty, someone longing for peace, for familiarity, perhaps for the freedom that her title denied her. Beyond the household, there was constant motion beneath the surface, a network of correspondence, trade, and diplomacy. Her clerks drafted letters to foreign courts, her almonors distributed charity to the poor, her stewards arranged banquets or journeys. Even her personal seal carried weight. A single wax imprint from her hand could legitimize marriages, grants, or treaties. The queen's household, then, was not merely domestic. It was an instrument of governance, where the private met the political, and always there was the tower, her highest room, quiet and overlooking the countryside. Here she read letters, wrote her diary, or simply watched the seasons turn. From this vantage, she could see far beyond her walls, yet she herself was seldom seen. It was a symbol of both privilege and isolation, a palace within a prison. The life of a medieval queen's household teaches us something profound about power, that authority is not only in battles or laws, but also in the quiet rituals of daily life, in the way a room is kept, in the way servants move through space, in the rhythm of routine that keeps chaos at bay. It was, in its own way, a form of stability that allowed kingdoms to endure. And so, as the candlelight fades from her chambers, the sounds of the household settle, the clink of dishes, the whisper of footsteps, the distant toll of the castle bell, the queen closes her eyes. Another day, another page in the long chronicle of waiting and rule, has come to its gentle end. In the medieval world, marriage was seldom a matter of affection. For queens and princesses, it was a contract of power, a treaty bound not by ink alone, but by flesh and lineage. To marry was to merge bloodlines, to secure peace, to turn enemies into kin, and sometimes to turn a stranger into a husband. Love, if it came, was often an afterthought. Politics always came first. From the moment a princess was born, her future was weighed in potential alliances. Courtiers speculated, ambassadors whispered. Would she wed a prince of France, a duke of Burgundy, or perhaps a distant heir, whose claim might strengthen her father's throne? By the time she learned to write her own name, letters had already been exchanged in her behalf. Her dowry calculated, her virtues praised, her worth expressed not in affection, but in gold and influence. She was, in the truest sense, a diplomatic offering a peace made flesh. The marriage negotiations were ceremonies in themselves. Delegates met across borders, trading oaths, gifts, and expectations. Dowries were discussed like military treaties, chests of silver, lands, promises of heirs. A papal blessing might be sought, for even the church's approval was another currency of legitimacy. When all was agreed, a marriage contract was drawn, pages of careful Latin spelling out what would happen if the husband died, if there were no heirs, or if peace should fracture again. And through it all, the princess, the one whose life was being bartered, waited in her tower, listening to news carried by messengers. When the day of departure came, it marked a quiet farewell to everything she knew. She left her homeland surrounded by attendants, her trousseau packed in wooden chests, each containing not only gowns and jewels, but small reminders of home, a book of hours, a keepsake, a lock of her mother's hair. As her ship or carriage departed, she might look back one last time at familiar hills or castle spires. From that moment on, she belonged to another country, another family, another destiny. Her arrival was often celebrated with pageantry, trumpets, garlands, processions, but behind the spectacle lay uncertainty. Would she be welcomed? Would her husband be kind? Would she be safe in this new court, where customs, languages, and loyalties differed? Many were not. A foreign queen, even when crowned, was never entirely trusted. She carried with her the suspicion of her origin, a symbol of another kingdom's influence. She learned quickly to walk carefully, to smile at enemies, to listen more than she spoke. And yet, despite these constraints, some queens mastered the art of diplomacy better than any man of their time. They turned their marriages into instruments of strategy, forging secret alliances, calming tempers, and mediating between rivals. Their gentleness became their weapon, their courtesy, their disguise. A single word spoken softly at the right moment could change the course of negotiations, avert a war, or secure a treaty. This was not submission, it was a different kind of power, rooted in observation, patience, and timing. Sometimes, however, marriages broke the peace they were meant to secure. Old enmities flared, dowries went unpaid, and kings blamed their wives for political misfortune. The queen became both bridge and scapegoat. If peace held, she was praised. If war came, she was cursed. And still, she endured, for endurance was her inheritance. There were exceptions, of course. Rare unions of affection that history remembers tenderly. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II began in passion, though it later turned to rivalry. Philip and Isabella of Spain ruled side by side, their partnership reshaping the map of Europe. But even these alliances of hearts were still alliances of crowns first. For a medieval queen, love was a luxury, duty was eternal. Through marriage, women carried culture across borders. They brought songs, fashions, languages, and traditions from one kingdom to another. They introduced new customs to foreign courts, Italian art, in France French manners in England, Spanish music in Austria. In this way, they became quiet ambassadors of civilization. While men fought and ruled, women connected and softened. They were the unseen threads that wove Europe together. And in those moments of stillness, when the ceremonies were over, and the torches burned low, perhaps, some of them wondered who they might have been if their lives had not been written by treaties. Would they have lived in their childhood castles, gardening, reading, singing at twilight? Would they have known peace instead of grandeur? We cannot know. No, but we can imagine their thoughts in the candlelight. A whisper of longing beneath the sound of history turning. Marriage, for the medieval queen, was both a beginning and an exile. It brought her power, but took her freedom. It placed a crown upon her head, but built walls around her heart. Yet without those marriages, nations would not have formed as they did. Peace, lineage, and empire were all carried in the silken thread of a bride's veil. So rest, now, and picture her carriage vanishing into the mist, its wheels creaking softly, its banners fluttering in the dawn. A princess leaves her homeland. A queen arrives in a new one, and history moves quietly on the rhythm of her breath. Power, in the medieval world, was rarely loud. It often moved in whispers, in glances exchanged across crowded halls, in the private conversations that followed public ceremony. For the queen, counsel was both privilege and peril. To speak too much invited suspicion. To remain silent risked error. She learned to balance both. To speak softly enough that her words could not be quoted, yet clearly enough that they would be remembered. While kings held courts of nobles and warriors, the queen's influence often flowed through the quieter channels of diplomacy and personal trust. Her chambers were gathering places for those who sought favor, but also for those who sought understanding. Ministers might come to her first, testing an idea before presenting it to the king. Ambassadors often confided in her, believing her sympathy more dependable than the volatility of men. And in the evening, when the court had gone still, she might speak to her husband not as a ruler, but as a companion, sharing thoughts that no advisor dared voice aloud. There is a certain rhythm to this kind of power. It is slow, deliberate, patient. It does not command armies, it guides minds. It shapes decisions, not by decree, but by suggestion. And yet, this quiet counsel could alter the course of empires. Eleanor of Aquitaine, again, was a master of it. A queen who advised, persuaded, and sometimes defied kings. Isabella of France, called the She-Wolf, used her intelligence and charm to maneuver through treacherous politics, eventually shaping England's destiny. Margaret of Anjou ruled through her husband's weakness, holding the crown together in his stead, and beyond them, countless Sicilian queens, women whose names faded, but whose decisions echoed in royal charters and treaties long after. In medieval Europe, a queen's advice carried spiritual as well as political weight. She was seen as a moral compass, a figure of grace and conscience, whose words could remind a ruler of divine justice. Chroniclers often wrote that the king's mercy was the queen's voice, when she interceded for a prisoner, pleaded for a pardon, or urged leniency in judgment. Her compassion humanized the crown. Through her, kings could show forgiveness without appearing weak. Through her, mercy became royal policy. But the queen's counsel could also be misunderstood. If she grew too influential, courtiers whispered of manipulation. If she aligned herself with one faction, the other might call her deceitful. She walked a narrow path between power and peril, visibility and secrecy. In that tension, her skill lay not in domination, but in endurance, in knowing when to speak, and when to let silence work for her. In many courts her influence extended to appointments and favors. A word from the queen could secure a marriage, an estate, or a pardon. Those who understood her value treated her not as decoration, but as the hidden key to access. And so, her presence shaped politics, even when she appeared only as a symbol. She was, as one chronicler wrote, the bridge between the heart and the crown. There was, too, the matter of correspondence. A queen's letters were among her most powerful tools. Written in her own hand or dictated to secretaries, they carried her tone, her tact, her understanding of diplomacy. In them, she could say what could not be said aloud, reassure allies, calm tensions, or delay rash decisions. Some of these letters survive, carefully worded, subtle, never revealing more than intended. They show the mind of a strategist operating through the language of grace. And when times turned difficult, when wars raged or courts divided, the Queen's counsel could serve as the last thread of unity. Her calmness in public steadied those around her. Even when she had little formal power, she embodied continuity, the idea that order could persist, even through turmoil. That is perhaps the truest form of leadership, to bring stillness where others bring noise. Behind the pomp of medieval courts, there was often an unseen conversation, a dialogue of two minds, husband and wife, balancing crown and conscience. It was in those moments that history quietly shifted. A war delayed, a treaty signed, a life espareth, all because a queen had spoken softly but wisely. In a world that prized swords and banners, it was the whisper that endured. For armies may win battles, but voices shape centuries. And so, when we think of the queens of the Middle Ages, it is worth remembering them not as passive figures in portraits, but as advisors, diplomats, thinkers, women who shaped kings without ever taking their thrones. Now the hall grows quiet again. The king has retired. The torches fade, and the council table is empty. Only a single candle burns near the window, its flame steady against the night air. There sits the queen, quill in hand, finishing one last letter, a message not of command, but of care. She signs her name, blows gently on the ink, and watches the wax seal cool beneath her fingertips. Her words, like her influence, will travel far beyond the castle walls. Faith, in the medieval world, was not an ornament. It was the air people breathed, woven into law, custom, birth, marriage, and death. For a queen, faith was both anchor and armor. When the world of politics turned sharp, she turned inward, toward devotion, toward the quiet certainties of ritual. Every castle had its chapel, a small room of stone and stained glass, and scent of beeswax and cold iron, mingling with the perfume of incense. Here, the queen knelt not as ruler or wife, but as a soul among souls, asking for strength, for mercy, for forgiveness perhaps, and sometimes for patience. The prayers she whispered were not always the ones written in the book. Some were improvised, woven from longing and memory. In times of joy, a child's birth, a victory, a safe return, she might send silver candlesticks to Boston, or commission a new altarpiece of gratitude. In times of sorrow, when plague came, or sons went to war, she might retreat for days, her crown set aside on a wooden stool, bare face bare her voice low. It was in these moments that the image of a queen changed from symbol of power to vessel of endurance. Faith also gave her a structure of thought, the rhythms of monastic hours, themes, thoughts, whispers, comfort, reminded her that even in waiting, time had meaning. Each prayer marked the turning of the day, each psalm a reassurance that even sorrow was part of a divine pattern. And so, the queen's solitude was not emptiness, but a kind of conversation between her own uncertainty and the eternal calm of the sacred. There were days when her faith was tested, when the court's cruelty or her husband's distance made the words of a prayer feel hollow, when she wondered whether heaven truly listened to the small voice of a lonely woman buried beneath silken ceremony. And yet, she prayed, for to stop would be to admit despair, and despair was considered the gravest sin of all. Some queens found comfort in patronage. They built convents and hospitals, not only as acts of charity, but as refuges for women like themselves, those who sought meaning beyond marriage. A few even corresponded with theologians, asking questions that were daring for their time, about the nature of virtue, about free will, about the balance between birth and beauty. Right. Behind the veil of piety, there was curiosity, and sometimes quiet rebellion. Queen Melisandre of Jerusalem, who ruled in the 12th century, was one such woman deep intellect. Her faith shaped her governance, but also gave her solitude dignity. She commissioned manuscripts of the Gospels illuminated in gold and lapis lazuli, their margins filled with tiny birds, vines, and angels, as if to say that beauty itself was a kind of worship. In those pages, she left behind not just devotion, but a reflection of a thoughtful, inward life. For many queens, faith became their truest legacy, not their crowns, not their portraits, but the abbeys and hospitals they founded, the prayers said in their name, long after their bones had turned to dust. A candle burning in a cloister, that was the afterglow there. In solitude, the queen might rediscover herself, the rituals of prayer offered rhythm where the world offered chaos. She might walk the cloister garden at dawn, to clinging to her shoes, the sound of bells faint through the mist. She would pause to breathe, and in that breath, feel again that she was not just a title, not just a wife or mother or figure of duty, but a person, small and yet eternal, seen by God. Therefore, solitude, then, was not loneliness. It was a discipline. A queen's strength lay not only in endurance, but in the grace to wait without bitterness. She waited in faith that every silence had meaning, every unanswered prayer was heard, and that every night, no matter how long it ended dawn, as time passed, her face might age, her influence wane, her children grew lands, she once governed. But the faith that steadied her in youth remained her quiet companion. When courtiers forgot her, the monks still prayed for her. When her jewels lost their shine, the chapel still glowed with morning light. In that persistence, in that soft defiance against the passage of time, lay the truest kind of sovereignty. And so the Queen of Solitude was not a void, but a vigil, patient, holy watching, awaiting that turn from duty to devotion, from power to peace. For even in her silence, she was keeping the realm's soul alive. When a queen's reign ended, the chroniclers recorded her lineage, her alliances, perhaps the children she bore, perhaps the wars fought in her name, but much of her true life, the patient word, the unseen endurance, was left between the lines. History, for many centuries, was written by men of power. Kings had their chronicles, knights their ballads, but queens were remembered in silences, in footnotes, prayers, and the walls of abbeys they had built. And yet, it is in those quiet traces that we find their real legacy. A queen's memory often survived not in words, but in the things she had touched. A jeweled psalter on her convent shelf, a stone chapel where her initials were carved near the altar, a faded tapestry that once hung behind her throne, its threads dull but still warm under candle. Each of these things was an act of persistence, a message to the future, a whisper that said, I was here, I mattered. When historians study queens today, they don't only ask what they were, but how they lived, and what that living tells us about the world that shaped her. The queen was both symbol and person, and her contradictions made her human. She could be revered as the Virgin Mary one day, and accused of Eve's ambition the next. She could be praised for mercy, then condemned for weakness. To be a queen was to walk a line drawn by other people's fears and expectations, but even within that narrow path, many left their own footprints, distinct, thoughtful, enduring. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, transformed politics itself, carving a space for female authority in manhood. Others, like Isabella of Castile, built empires, but also funded voyages that reshaped the world for better or worse. And others still were guarded smaller kingdoms, became quiet architects of charity, protectors of the poor, patrons of learning, or guardians of fragile peace. Each, in her own way, left something behind that outlasted her crown. When we speak of legacy, we often imagine monuments, but the most enduring legacies are sometimes invisible. A softened law, a library that still stands, a lullaby passed through generations, a story that makes someone believe that even in waiting, there can be dignity. For every great event written in the annals of kings, there were the steady hands of queens, keeping the world from unraveling. The tower, once a prison of expectation, becomes, in memory, a place of perspective. The woman inside it, who seemed small against the storm, was in fact part of something vast, the slow shaping of human understanding. Centaurus, though history rarely said so, that patience is a kind of courage. change. That gentleness can outlast tyranny. That silence, when chosen, can be strength. As centuries passed, their names faded from the chronicles, but their influence became part of the landscape itself, woven into customs, languages, and even faith. The rhythm of devotion that once filled their chapels now lives on in the quiet ways people still pray, still wait for meaning to return. Queen's solitude has long since become our own. For in every age, human beings look for balance between power and peace, between the noise of the world and the calm of the self. And so, when we think of the medieval queen in her lonely tower, embroidering, waiting, thinking, we might see not a prisoner, but a witness, a keeper of mysteries, stillness, a voice that speaks not through conquest, but through ignorance. In her waiting, she became part of a long continuum of those who hold the world together quietly. Her story is not of glory, but of grace, the kind that survives storms without ever needing to shout. So tonight, as you listen and drift toward rest, imagine the last candle flickering in that ancient tower. Outside, the stars stretch over the medieval world, the same stars that shine above you now. Time holds softly. The queen bows her head in prayer, and you breathe in rhythm with her. The same quiet rhythm with every human who ever loved, ever waited, ever believed that their small life could hold something eternal. The last light fades, and in that stillness, the tower is not lonely anymore. It is simply